What I'd like to share with you is a very simple overview of how our brain works. And we start with the brain stem. And the brain stem at the base of our skulls is responsible for basic functions around temperature, heart rate, breathing, and reflexes. Okay? Next up, we have the amygdala. It's about the size of an almond that holds for us our emotional memory and emotional learning. And this is, in fact, the part of the brain that helps us to know in difficult situations whether we're going to fight or flee. Okay? Whether we're going to fight or flee. And lastly, last but not least, we have the neocortex. And that's the part of our brain that really, where our IQ resides, where we can be more logical. It's the site of working memory. If we go back to the amygdala, I'm remembering a story that was particularly impactful for me around this whole notion of emotional memory, which we all live with. And the story goes something like this, that someone had been on an African safari. And one morning when they walked outside of his tent, the man inadvertently stepped on a snake. Now, thankfully, it wasn't dangerous. It wasn't a life-threatening scenario, but it could have been. And you can imagine when he did that, what kind of reaction, that should I fight or should I run kind of response. Well, fast forward 10 years later, the same gentleman is doing a presentation and steps on the cord of a projector. What do you think happens? Right? He's back in Africa. He's got that immediate emotional memory. So the work for us then is to learn what in fact happens when we have those kinds of experiences, and we call that in our work an emotional hijack. So let me ask you a few questions. How many of you have ever been in a situation where you were in a very difficult conversation with someone and you mentally froze? And sometime later, you've thought about what you coulda, woulda, shoulda said. How many? Pretty common experience. How many of you have been in a meeting where you were determined that you were going to say no to yet one more task that you had the opportunity to say yes or no to, and you left having said yes? Right? And so with those two scenarios, what we've had is the experience of an emotional hijack. And we want to understand how that dynamic works, because if we know how that dynamic works, we have the capacity to manage it. So the way it works is we have something that triggers our amygdala, size of the almond, right? Site of emotional memory. That could be something that someone says. It actually could be a feeling or a thought that we have from the inside out. It could be somebody's behavior that triggers an emotional response. And what happens physiologically is that the amygdala fires, love that word, fires cortisol into our neocortex, and we can't think. And there are degrees of emotional hijacks. So in a full emotional hijack, we literally cannot think. We shut down. And that's that experience of being in that situation where we mentally freeze. And then when we're driving home, we appreciate what we could have, should have said in that situation, right? Well, that's not something that you can just wish into, because that really is a physiological response. And when that happens, we have less perspective, we have less ability for judgment, we have more certainty. So that's typically something that we pay attention to in terms of when somebody's emotionally hijacked. If we get so certain that there's only one way, right? There's only one answer. Very likely that if we've moved into that kind of place, it's because we've been emotionally hijacked. Because rarely is there one way or one answer about anything. Rarely. We also, in that process, have less self-control. We make more errors, and we move toward our default behaviors, those behaviors that we'd really like to avoid, and yet we can get hooked into. So, in order to imagine, or in order to manage, not imagine, because we don't have to imagine, we know when we're emotionally hijacked. In order to imagine that, we have to pay attention to the signals, to the signs. When you are in an emotional hijack or beginning an emotional hijack, that you experience an increase in heart rate, that you might find your jaws clenching, palms sweating. We really get signals that we need to pay attention to, because when we're at the beginning of an emotional hijack, we have the capacity to manage it. We have the capacity to reverse an emotional hijack, especially if we can catch it on the front end. Now remember that when we are emotionally hijacked, we lose our capacity to think in degrees according to how advanced the hijack is. So I really like you to think about, in your own experience, how many decisions get made in boardrooms, executive suites, on teams, in families, in any kinds of groups, where at least one person, probably more, isn't at least at the beginning of an emotional hijack. And what's the cost of that? The cost is we're not at full tilt. The cost is we don't have everyone's best capability at the table. That's the cost. And that's why it's so important that we really understand and recognize when we're having an emotional hijack. It's been exciting for us, for members of our team, when we've worked with leadership teams who learn this language. And we've been in meetings with them where an executive will say, "Time out. I'm emotionally hijacked. I need a break." Or to be able to recognize, this is the other part of it, recognize it in myself, but also, can I recognize those signals in someone else? When somebody gets really flushed, when somebody's jaw is clenched after I've just said something, do I have the capacity to appreciate, whoops, something's happening for that person that would be good for me to pay attention to, if we are going to be able to continue this conversation? So our bodies are our early warning signals and let us know when in fact we are in an emotional hijack.